Citizens of the world. I'm Padmini Arhant, author and presenter padminiarhant.com as well as prakriti.padminiarhant.com. I represent the divine mission in the name of Almighty God, whom I represent in spirit, soul, and flesh. I present my thoughts on Syria's chemical attack. President of the United States, Donald Trump, made a public statement this evening confirming United States airstrikes that were declared precision strikes against Syria's targeted positions in Syria. I would like to share my thoughts and also discuss about the Syrian affair. First of all, the missile strike that was just confirmed by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, against Syria, whether it be one or two or three, regardless, is worthy of condemnation. Again, I emphasize United States precision strikes against Syria is worthy of condemnation. It is condemnable. The reason I say that is because the airstrikes and military actions that are arbitrarily taken by United States along with their allies, specifically United Kingdom and France, proved counterproductive. More than that, it has been launched under false pretext. I would like to walk you on why I assume this position. Again, I would like to remind members listening to my presentation that I am not reading from a teleprompter or a scripted message. This message is coming extemporaneously, nonetheless, presenting the facts as they are, without any concoction or fabrication. I talked about this in length this afternoon, and my message was heard by those who do pay attention ordinarily and otherwise to what I have to say and do in terms of international events, affairs, and other issues as well. So now I would like to talk about Syrian affair. Syria has been forced into international confrontation. Syria has been transformed into a war zone. This is going back in 2011 when the Arab Spring that originally started in Tunisia, the North African nation of Tunisia, and then spread across the Middle East, that is Egypt, and then Libya, and then on to Syria. With Syria, the situation was taken advantage of by those who had already targeted Syria or listed Syria in their target list. Project for New American Century. That is an imperial agenda that had been conceptualized going back in the late 90s or even earlier. But then it materialized on September 11, 2001 with the terror attack against United States. So the Project for New American Century was the imperial agenda to strike nations in different parts of the world for imperial goals. This is to establish strategic dominance and gain economic interest. With the terror attack on the United States, that is on September 11, 2001, the forces behind this Project for New American Century were able to invade nations one after another. They pursued Afghanistan and then on to Iraq, then later the other nations that were in their target list, like Libya, Syria was definitely one of them, and then Sudan. So there were nations that were earmarked for this purpose. Now, with Syria in 2011, in the wake of Arab Spring, the situation was used by the forces who had been aiming for Project for New American Century to materialize in that part of the world, that is the Middle East, with Syria in mind. They exploited that situation. And this, I say this unequivocally, the reason being the situation at that point in 2011 could have been peacefully resolved had there not been international intervention. But then that was not allowed to happen. The administration, then administration, headed by former President Barack Obama and former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, were instrumental in accelerating the pace in terms of violence, and that evolved into a quagmire in Syria. The terrorists, the terror networks were moved. They were moved from Libya and Afghanistan. They were relocated from Libya and Afghanistan into Syria. These terror networks were initially the Al Qaeda forces from Afghanistan and Libya, were relocated to Syria to fight against the Syrian government, represented by the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The terror network that was initially Al Qaeda evolved into Al Nusra Front, then became Daesh, and then there's ISIL. That's when the ISIL was created, the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. Then it became ISIS, the Islamic State of for Syria, and then they gave another name called IS. So they kept inventing new names for these terror outfits that they relocated from Afghanistan and Libya, and they funded these terror networks. They provided all kinds of ammunitions, the weapons supply. The weapons have been flowing in from different parts. They were transported via Croatia, for example, and in the Eastern Europe, Croatia to Saudi Arabia. They had their allies who have diligently cooperated in escalating violence in Syria. Let there be no misconceptions in that regard. United States and allies, the Western allies, as I mentioned, Britain, France, and Israel, and then in the Middle East, their allies besides Israel has been Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and they had other regional partners, but Saudi Arabia and Qatar were initially very active, but then they managed to get their NATO partner, NATO ally, Turkey. Turkey got vigorously involved under the leadership of then Prime Minister, now turned President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So there has been, massive collusion in inflating the violence and terrorism in Syria. So let there be no, you know, misconception, or let there be no doubts about it, that the whole idea of Syria being presented as a civil war in itself is a deception. Again, this has been transformed into a international warfare, and this again, with the focus on PNAC, which is the Project for New American Century, where Syria has been one of the nations in the target list. Now, the terror networks that were funded with training provided to these terrorists, various terror outfits were recruited from different parts of the world, predominantly Islamic nations, but then more and more terror operatives were recruited from Europe itself. Again, let there be no misunderstanding in this respect either. The terror operatives from Europe were also recruited, and they were provided training in Jordan by CIA, Mossad, and the terror outfits who have been wounded in the confrontation have been provided medical aid and assistance, and all kinds of medical relief by Israeli authorities in the disputed territory of Syria that has been occupied by Israel, the Golan Heights, in Syria. So that's where Israeli authorities have been providing the medical assistance to the terror outfits wounded in the confrontation between the terror networks and the Syrian Defense Force. So the war has been going on since 2011. Again, though it has been projected as a civil war, which in itself is a big deception, for it is a lie. This has not been a civil war. This has been a war that has been brought upon the people of Syria by the same forces who have been involved in the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq, and that goes for Afghanistan, and and then you have the history before you. So the illegal occupation, invasion and occupation of foreign land, that has been the principal focus and ideology that continues unabated until today, regardless of administrations in power. With Syria, the talk of chemical attacks and the use of chemical weapons is nothing new. This has been tried earlier on by the predecessor, the former administration under the presidency of Barack Obama. So the chemical attack that has been claimed by the United States and allies, though they have consistently failed to provide evidence, for the terror networks are the ones who have been supplied with not only the conventional weapons cache, the artillery and ammunitions, along with any other logistic capabilities that were required. But then they have also been the terror outfits have been able to access chemical weapons, the biological weapons. That has been proved by the international agencies who were deployed in the wake of these allegations about chemical attack in Syria. So the earlier administration under President Barack Obama and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, when they accused the Syrian government of chemical attack, there were investigations that were held. This was in 2013 and 2015, if I'm not mistaken. The United Nations authorized agency representing the United Nations Security Council and United Nations appointed agency OPCW, that stands for Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons. They were deployed to investigate then alleged chemical attack that was again the government, Syrian government, were accused of using chemical weapons when the Syrian defense forces, the defense personnel, were the victims of the chemical attack then. I mean, it is unthinkable that the Syrian defense force that is fighting against the terror outfits deployed by the West and their allies in the Middle East would use chemical weapons against their own defense force, debilitating their own efforts in the war against terror. I mean, think about this. Anyone in their right sense of mind would think twice before indulging in such stupidity to hurt your own force with chemical weapons or biological weapons. And that is precisely what happened earlier on, in the sense with the accusation against the Syrian government on the chemical attack. But then it is not that the chemical attack had not taken place earlier on. The chemical attacks had taken place, but it has been carried out by the terror outfits who have had direct access to the biological weapons and the stockpiles that were again courtesy Turkey, the Turkish government, not the people in Turkey. The people in Turkey had vehemently protested against Turkey's intervention in Syria, and so did the population of any nation when they are disillusioned with the perpetual military intervention or sponsoring terrorism against people of foreign land. So what happened with Syria? The Syrian government has been accused time and time again. So that prompted the international investigation by an international authority that was actually selected and appointed by none other than the United Nations. The United Nations Security Council approved that body, the agency, the Organization for Prevention of Chemical Weapons, who conducted the investigation, and any stockpiles, any biological or chemical weapons that were found to be in the possession of the Syrian state, the Syrian authorities, were removed. And this is what was publicly claimed by the former administration of President Barack Obama. And this was again confirmed and corroborated by the UN authorities as well. So this was basically and categorically declared that the chemical weapons, any biological or chemical agents in possession of Syrian authorities, Syrian government, have been removed from Syrian authorities' possession. And this was clarified, this was confirmed after verification by UN authorized OPCW, that it concurred with those who were present in the investigation, that the chemical weapons and stockpiles have been disposed and they are no longer in Syrian state authorities' possession. So this was the statement that was released to the public, to not only in the United States, to the entire world. And the administration headed by former President Barack Obama even claimed credit for disarming Syria with of this biological chemical weapons and biological stockpiles. And now the current administration by the incumbent president Donald Trump have been claiming that there has been chemical attacks, and going back again, in 2017 and now 2018, and according to the UN ambassador to United States ambassador to UN, Nikki Haley, has been commenting about the use of chemical weapons against the people in Syria, and alleging that the Syrian government has been responsible. And she also went on to say that there has been the chemical weapons have been used. I quote Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. She claims that there has been 50 times the chemical weapons have been used against the people in Syria. I mean, this is incredible in terms of, blowing anything out of proportion, and you can name it fabrication. This is baseless, the preposterous allegation. The reason I say this is because the earlier administration under President Barack Obama categorically declared that the Syrian government have been disarmed of any biological and chemical weapons. And this was the statement by then administration was concurrently admitted by the UN authorities and the agency that was deployed for that purpose, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons. So now this administration comes along and claims that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons at least 50 times, they claim. I mean, how long this administration has been in power, by the way? They were just sworn into office, if my memory serves me right, in 2017, January 2017, and now come 2018, they have only been in power for a year and a half, or even even less than that, not even 18 months. And then they claim that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons at least 50 times. So now I would like the world to raise this question, for this is really important. Whatever that is going on, it's not them demonstrating their courage. On the contrary, they are they're exhibiting their cowardliness with lies and deception that the world has been subject to continuously, and it just seems to have no end in sight. And again, the forces that are responsible for human suffering, since they are never held accountable, they are never brought to justice, the events are cyclical. I am referring to United States and their allies, Britain, France, and others in the Middle East. They have been involved in this massive invasion and occupation, sponsoring terrorism, and creating havoc wherever possible. For they are never questioned, they are never challenged, they are never even held accountable for anything that they have done up until now. So there has been this assumption that they can carry on with this forever, and there should be no questions asked, and they are unstoppable. But this is where they are mistaken. I repeat, they are mistaken in this respect. The reason being the time is different. Whether they are prepared to acknowledge that or not, that's something different. That is their problem. But then the time is different now. And it is about time that they recognize the difference. And for whatever that is happening right now, they are not really exhibiting courage. They are simply testing the will of God. They are testing the patience of God. They are really trying to figure out how far they can go, much to their own detriment, may I add. And I would also like to remind the military industrial complex behind such military actions that are always more eager, regardless of consequences. I mean, again, this is a proven fact, people of the world. Military industrial complex desire for military interventions and actions. The reason being the defense industry stockpiles that are, they feel that there is a need to exhaust those stockpiles, the inventory, so that they can replenish the stock. And then there is massive investment in defense sector as well. So there is a lot of things that that is involved when they talk about military interventions. It is predominantly for profitability, and secondly for exerting authority and dominance that cannot be ruled out. And again, this imperial quest also comes into play. So these are all the factors that are clearly visible, and this has been proven time and time again. But again, what they are not learning, or they have failed to understand, is the miserable failure. The miserable failure. Every time the military industrial complex initiated military actions and illegal invasion and occupation of foreign land, going back to Vietnam War, and then the Afghanistan and Iraq, wherever they have been, their adventures, their misguided adventures, proved to be a miserable failure. Yet they don't seem to learn from the mistakes, for they do not even recognize those adventures as mistake. That is the problem with them. And regardless of administrations in power, Democrat or Republican, the military adventures must continue as long as far as they are concerned. And and those who do not toe the line, you know what happens. So I would like to emphasize to these members that you're actually not demonstrating your military might, your prowess. You're trying to test God's will, God's patience. And President of the United States, Donald Trump, you're mistaken in thinking that God is with you in your actions. God does not favor. I repeat, God does not favor deceit, deception, and anything to do with violation of lives and human rights. So let there be no misconception. Let there be no perception that God is with those forces, that is with you and your allies in your deceptive activities, such as what you have done now. Your missile strikes against Syria is nothing but your lack of credibility and your lack of integrity to acknowledge the situation in Syria. The situation in Syria is that Syrian defense forces have made remarkable progress despite despite the challenges posed to them in all these years. Since 2011 up until now, the Syrian Defense Force has been able to make considerable progress, and of course, they have had other forces who have been able to assist them to prevent the spillover violence and warfare in their territory, like Lebanon, and then with Russia, Russian intervention um, coming back in the later part of the international warfare in Syria. So there is no doubt that the forces in Lebanon and with Iran and Russia, uh, there has been some uh, assistance that were provided, and that has been um, timely, and at the same time it has been necessary as well. But then, other than that, the defense force in Syria have been able to confront the international forces, United States, uh, Britain, France, and then their partners in the Middle East, Turkey, and Israel, and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and I believe Kuwait, and United Arab Emirates, UAE. So there has been this international, the regional and international coalition, all um, against targeting the Syrian forces, and this is nothing to do with democratizing Syria or liberating Syrian people as they have claimed, which has been a slogan that has been used um, earlier on against Iraq. If you all remember how the Iraq War started, with democratizing Iraq, and then what happened? Iraq has been decimated, and Iraq has been turned into a terror haven. There was no sign of terror outfits or terror networks existence in Iraq up until um, the invasion of illegal invasion of Iraq. So then, subsequently, the terror networks and terror outfits were relocated, as I said, from Libya and other parts of North Africa, like Morocco, Algeria, and then so they were relocated. These were the Al Qaeda forces. They were mobilized for this reason, for the purpose of destabilizing Iraq, Syria, and then you can expect the contagion effect in the entire region of the Middle East. So this has been the agenda, and this was systematically implemented by the former administration of the President Barack Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and subsequently by this administration now with the President Donald Trump. So, administrations come and go, but then the policy never changes. I don't think, that should come as a surprise to any of you. So this has been the pattern, folks. This has been the pattern. And this is how the system is run. And now with the chemical attack, the allegations about chemical attack, let me remind you that the same governments, whether it be United States and their allies, I would like to remind them that when there is such hue and cry about the alleged chemical attacks by the Syrian government against their own people, let me remind the world that it's United States, together with their ally Britain and the NATO partnership, the NATO coalition against Iraq, in the aftermath of illegal invasion of Iraq, what did they do? They used depleted uranium in Fallujah. The um, uh, the forces who were deployed um, in Iraq, the veterans, the Iraq War veterans who have been completely, disillusioned by um, the the kind of warfare they have been um, involved in, and many of them, sadly, have they are not even able to deal with the emotional issues and the ethical problems that they have had to deal with for um, as being part of the defense force of the United States. They had to simply obey order, and they when they came back home, they were completely traumatized, considering what they had to do against the innocent children, women, and men in Iraq, um, whether it be Fallujah or Baghdad or Mosul, and so different parts of Iraq that was continuously um, uh, rained with bombs, mother cluster bombs and mother of bombs, and depleted uranium and what have you. And now the same government of United States is talking about, and that goes for their allies as well. They're talking about humanitarianism and their concern for people um, suffering from this alleged chemical attacks. Isn't that incredible? And these are the questions that I raise with these authorities and the heads of the states. Now, in their cabinet meetings, they seem to be expressing their concerns and thoughts when their governments have been consistently involved in something even more horrific than what they are describing as horror. I mean, this is nothing more than a hypocrisy on their part when they have um, uh, systematically been involved in carrying out attacks, air raids, and that goes for Libya as well. What did they do? They created this no-fly zone in Libya, and then under no-fly zone, the Libyan government at that point, headed by again none other than the Western ally Muammar, Colonel Gaddafi, um, was restricted from using any of their limited, aircrafts under the no-fly zone, and then that no-fly zone was taken advantage of, and Britain and France, Britain under the leadership of David Cameron, then Prime Minister David Cameron, and then French President Nicolas Sarkozy, they both authorized the air raids, and then using false pretext. So this has been a pattern, and the same thing would go for Iraq as well. Iraq was the illegal invasion of Iraq itself was carried out under false pretext, claiming that Iraq had chemical weapons that proved to be false. And again, the earlier Iraqi invasion by the senior Bush, uh, that is George Bush Sr., um, they used the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter as a local Iraqi citizen, and made her to testify to UN and the rest of the world that then President Saddam Hussein was, throwing the babies from the incubator and so on. I mean, this really highly fictionalized, concocted, their interesting and dramatic presentations is nothing new. Again, this has been a pattern. This has been the strategy for the forces who are determined. They are determined to continue with their policy of creating havoc and catastrophe wherever possible. You know, wherever you find their footprints, all that you see is carnage and mayhem, nothing else. I mean, and for them to claim that they are horrified and they are in complete shock, and they are expressing their dismay is indeed nothing more than a theatrical, and this is something that the world should be accustomed to by now. But then again, I say to you, don't become too accustomed to this kind of repeat lies and deception and pretext, the false pretexts that are being used for military actions, and as a matter of fact, sponsoring terrorism against um, the people of foreign land. That in itself has been a heinous crime that has been the hallmark now of United States and allies. The terror attack that was launched against United States on September 11, 2001 became the premise for them to use that strategy against other nations in their target list. And that is precisely what has been happening up until now. So, as far as Syrian population fate is concerned, it is entirely the Syrian people's right. It is the Syrian people are the ones who are eligible and entitled to determine their fate, their political system, and decide who should govern the state. I don't think, any of you who are listening to what I'm saying right now, wherever you are, would possibly agree with any other nation, whether they are your neighbor or anyone in the region, or for that matter, um, across the world, coming in and, letting you know who should be your the head of the state, who should be your prime minister or president, and whom you should consider the legitimate government. When you come to think of it, the Syrian people have been deprived of their basic fundamental right to towards self-determination. Self-determination and territorial integrity has been seriously violated by the Western forces, the Western governments led by United States and allies like Britain and France, along with their partners in the Middle East, like, as I said, Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the rest. So now, with the missile strikes and the ongoing allegations about chemical attack, when it has been proved time and time again, it has been proved to be false, to be baseless. The reason being, the chemical attacks that take place, they are for sure happening, but it is not happening from the forces that they claim, the Western governments are claiming. That is, they are accusing the Syrian government and Syrian authorities as the responsible party, when their terror networks, the terror outfits whom they have installed, whom they have promoted, fostered in Syria and Iraq, as well as in across the Middle East, who originally came from North Africa and Afghanistan, like, as I said in the earlier segment. So now, with the terror networks and outfits funded and enabled, and they are provided all kinds of access, they are the ones who are involved in the repeat use of chemical weapons and all kinds of activities that has been proved time and time again and again, regardless of the censorship on press and the complete control over communication media by the forces who do not want the world to know the truth. I would like to say this to the world, that you need to become more vigilant. You need to become more alert and active in accessing information rather than being hopelessly dependent on your conventional communication media and channels, for they are completely under control of the forces who do not want facts and truth to be told to the people of the world, that is you. Again, I emphasize the allegations, the chemical attack allegations only lead to the question that I have, which I raised earlier on. And I repeat that question. The former administration by President Barack Obama categorically claimed that the Syrian authorities, the Syrian government headed by the President Bashar al-Assad, that government has been disarmed. I repeat, this was the statement, a public statement that was released by the former administration of President Barack Obama. And this statement has been endorsed, and it has been confirmed by the UN authorities, the agency that was deployed then, the Operation, Organization for Prevention of Chemical Weapons, OPCW. They also concurred that any weapons, chemical or biological weapons that were in Syrian government's possession have all been, removed from the facilities in Syria, and they've all been disposed of, miles away, and they were removed from the state of Syria itself. If that statement had any credibility and any validity, then what is being said now by the current administration could not be true. I mean, now I am asking you to, think about this. The earlier administration claimed that, they had disarmed the government, and then the current administration is claiming that, to be otherwise. So who is telling the truth? So it's now between the two administrations there appears to be, inconsistency in their statements and their positions as well. But when it comes to strikes, yes, they are parallel. As a matter of fact, there is no change in position whatsoever. They just launch strikes. They authorize the missile strikes and the air strikes that has just been claimed by the current administration. So I would like to, end this presentation by saying that God never favors violence, deceitful actions, and military or military interventions or sponsoring terrorism. I mean, there appears to be this delusional expectation that somehow God will be guiding such actions. God never favors such activities. God is never behind or providing any guidance to those who are so determined to violate lives, inflict pain and suffering on people in foreign land for economic interest and strategic dominance. So I would like to remind the forces as well as those who are the heads of the states, whether it be the President of the United States, Donald Trump, or the Prime Minister of Britain, Theresa May, and that goes for French President Emmanuel Macron, let there be no misconception in this regard that God is with you in your actions. For again, God does not favor deception, lies, and fabrication. And the ongoing issue with Syria is another. It's cyclical. There is a pattern, as I have said. They claim the same thing about Iraq, and they decimated Iraq with military strikes and military intervention and deployment of troops on the ground, and they are aiming for the same approach in Syria as well, which is counterproductive, and this is something that will not deliver, I emphasize, will not deliver their desirable outcome. If at all, that would only be undesirable, that would only be destructive and catastrophic. Hope, rationale, and level-headedness would come into play rather than ego and presumptuousness that are on display right now. Again, Syrian defense forces had made remarkable progress against the terror outfits deployed, funded, and energized by Western governments and Western forces. Those who are behind this regime change, the so-called regime change agenda, that they are so typically they are obsessed with the concept of regime change, and I have said, if they are so much interested in regime change, they should start regime change in their own camp. There is an urgent requirement for regime change in their own camp. That is something that they need to think about. So I would say, with anything, you have to begin, you have to begin at your in your own backyard. You have to, like charity begins at home. So likewise, if you want regime change, anything you want to start, you want to bring about a change, that change has to commence at your end first. So let that begin in your camp. They are desperately required. They are desperately required in your camp with Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. They are all the close allies, and that goes for State of Israel as well. The Israeli authorities, denying the Palestinians the statehood and the basic freedom, and how they have been oppressed and persecuted for more than 7 decades. So what about, the regime change there? So I'm saying that if you're so much concerned about regime change, and if regime change is what all you want and desire, so I said you should begin that with your camp and let that begin at your end. Then we can, think about elsewhere. Don't you think that is fair? You need to get your own house in order before you go about, telling others what to do. So, and this is why I say to you again, President Donald Trump, please do not think that God favors such actions. God never favors actions such as yours, the military strikes under false pretext. If at all, such actions are unequivocally condemned by God. And I end my presentation here, and I will be back with more on events in Syria and elsewhere. Before I conclude, I also would like to add that it's time to consider, not just consider, to work towards ceasefire. A complete ceasefire is what is required in Syria, and the removal of forces especially the terror outfits, the terror networks who have been deployed across the state of Syria. Every one of them, every one of them need to be disarmed, and they need to be removed from not only the state of Syria, from the region, the Middle East region. So, and those who are responsible as sponsors, the United States and allies, they need to work in this respect, and that is what is urgently required more than anything. I am Padmini Arhant, author and presenter, padminiarhant.com, as well as prakriti.padminiarhant.com. Again, as a representative of divine mission, in the name of Almighty God, whom I represent in spirit, soul, and flesh, I would like to um, uh, thank you all for your attention and interest.